Hey guys, tonight we walk straight into a place where sharp axes, sharper tongues, and even sharper memories ruled. You step onto the rough, wind-swept grass of a massive open-air circle. No walls, no roof, just sky above, and Viking justice unfolding below. Welcome to the thing. You probably won't survive this, honestly. If you accidentally insult the wrong person here, you might find yourself challenged to a duel before lunch. And let's just say Viking duels don't end with hugs and high fives. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And of course, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step further into the open ring, surrounded by long-bearded men in thick wool cloaks, sturdy boots caked with mud, and belts weighed down with blades and drinking horns. The wind carries voices low, intense, sometimes laughing, sometimes shouting as disputes and accusations swirl like the cold northern breeze. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The thing was the heart of Viking legal and political life. From Norway to Iceland to the Faroe Islands, Norse communities gathered regularly in these open-air assemblies to resolve disputes, pass laws, and govern themselves collectively. There are no stone fortresses or marble columns here. The power lies in the people gathered, farmers, chieftains, merchants, and warriors, each with a voice, each with a stake in the judgments handed down beneath the wide sky. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Viking things were held on neutral islands or hilltops believed to be spiritually balanced, ensuring that neither side in a dispute could claim home advantage. Basically, ancient Scandinavia invented the legal version of playing on neutral ground. Historians still argue whether the thing system was primarily democratic or an elite-controlled negotiation disguised as public debate. Some point to widespread participation by free men as evidence of early grassroots governance. Others note the influence wielded by powerful families behind the scenes. You watch as a group assembles around a speaker standing atop a flat stone, the law speaker, whose voice rings out across the circle. His role isn't to create the law, but to remember it, reciting vast portions from memory, ensuring every man present knows exactly where the boundaries of justice lie. The crowd listens carefully, some nodding, others muttering as their cases approach. Beyond them, tents and market stalls form a temporary village. Merchants selling salted fish iron tools and warm furs, while children chase each other between barrels and wagons. You can feel the electricity in the air. This isn't some dry courtroom. This is living law, passionate, public, and often dangerously personal. Every case carries real consequences for land, for honor, for life itself. And as you settle in, you realize this is only the surface. Because behind every argument, every verdict, and every oath sworn here lies a world of tradition, power, and ritual that made Viking law circles far more than simple meetings. Next, you'll step back into the earliest origins of the thing, where wild clans first gathered in these open circles to tame chaos with words before swords had to finish the argument. The cold wind carries the distant call of gulls as you picture the earliest gatherings that birthed this tradition. Before kings and formal laws, before stone markers and memorized codes, there were only scattered Norse clans, isolated farmers, fishermen, and warriors, trying to keep peace in a harsh and unforgiving land. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The origins of the thing assemblies stretch back to at least the 7th century, if not earlier. Long before centralized rule took hold, Norse communities developed these open-air meetings as a way to handle disputes, establish rules, and share power among free men. You see them now, small groups assembling on grassy hilltops or riverbanks, each man bringing his grievances, his witnesses, and his sharp tongue. There are no scrolls, no judges in robes, just a circle of equals watched carefully by neighbors and kin. Here's your quirky tidbit. Early things often met at sites marked by natural features, a prominent tree, a boulder, or even an ancient burial mound. The land itself became part of the legal ceremony, as though the ancestors were listening and weighing every word. Historians still argue whether these gatherings began as purely practical solutions or whether they held deeply spiritual significance from the start. Some believe the circular layout symbolized balance and cosmic order, mirroring Norse beliefs in cycles, fate, and harmony with nature. Others suggest that the earliest things were simply functional neutral spaces to avoid bloodshed when tempers flared. You watch as one chieftain stands to present his case, his voice steady, but his hand never far from the hilt of his axe. Across the circle, his rival responds, flanked by family members and allies, who murmur agreements or glare silently. There is no judge here. Instead, the gathered free men serve as jury, listening carefully, weighing evidence, and casting their votes by majority. This system forces negotiation, compromise, and occasionally spectacular shouting matches that attract half the village like an ancient reality show. Here's where you notice something powerful. Despite their reputation for violence, the Vikings deeply valued settlement and consensus. In a world where feuds could last for generations, the Thing offered a rare chance to resolve conflicts before swords were drawn. One elder steps forward now, raising his staff to silence the crowd. "Let words rule where blades would bleed," he declares, and the assembly nods. They've seen too many neighbors lost to blood feuds. This is their attempt at peace. The earliest Things didn't just handle disputes. They set rules for inheritance, land boundaries, marriage rights, and trade agreements. Over time, the spoken decisions of these circles became customary law passed orally, from one generation to the next, solidifying into a flexible but respected legal tradition. Here's your fringe debate. Some scholars argue that these early Things represent a rare form of decentralized participatory governance, unusual for their era. A proto-democracy that contrasts sharply with the monarchies and empires rising elsewhere. Others caution against romanticizing them too much, pointing out that many voices, women, slaves, and the landless remained excluded. As you stand in the growing crowd, you can feel how much these early assemblies mattered. The Thing wasn't just law, it was identity. It allowed fiercely independent Norse clans to coexist, settle grievances, and define shared values in a world where survival demanded both unity and personal freedom. And as the shouting fades and decisions are made, you'll next see how these circular meetings weren't just practical. They carried sacred meaning tied to the Vikings' deep beliefs about fate, order, and the very structure of their universe. The breeze cuts a little sharper now, as if the air itself listens to the words carried inside the circle. You step back slightly, sensing that what happens here isn't only legal, it's cosmic. The circle isn't just a convenient way to fit everyone in. It means something far older, far deeper. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Viking assemblies were nearly always held in open-air circles, a design choice scholars believe was rooted in both practicality and deeply ingrained Norse cosmology. The circle symbolized balance, equality, and the cycles of nature. You scan the assembly space, a perfect ring, sometimes marked by standing stones, sometimes by timber posts, sometimes simply traced into the earth. But always a circle. There's no head of the table, no throne elevated above the rest. Everyone stands inside this enclosed sky, looking inward together under the gaze of their gods. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some regions, such as Iceland, the sacred spaces where things met were called law rings. Early attendees may have literally stood or sat in concentric rings around the law speaker, creating a visual ripple effect, almost like a human reflection of Yggdrasil, the great world tree binding Norse cosmology. Historians still argue whether these circular designs were chosen primarily for religious reasons, or simply as a functional way to manage a large, loud, argumentative crowd. Some suggest the form mimicked ancient rituals that predated even Viking society, while others propose that the practical acoustics of the circle made it easier to hear whoever spoke. You feel the energy swirl around you as another dispute begins. Two brothers argue fiercely over a disputed pasture, but both remain firmly inside the circle's invisible boundary, as if stepping outside would break something larger than the case itself. The circle acts as both container and protector, ensuring that words, not weapons, hold sway here. Outside the ring, old grudges could turn deadly, but inside men commit to settling their disputes before the watchful eyes of neighbors, ancestors, and gods. You glance toward a weathered stone standing near the circle's edge. Such stones were often seen as witnesses to the decisions made here, silent, unchanging, and ever-present. Even long after every man gathered here is dust, that stone will still remember. Here's where you sense the layered symbolism the circle represents, not just fairness, but also the delicate cycle of reciprocity that held Viking society together. Give and take offense and compensation, honor and shame. The law doesn't eliminate conflict. It contains it, shaping it into something survivable. As the assembly proceeds, a hush falls. One man steps forward to swear an oath before presenting his claim. He places his hand on a hallowed staff, invoking the gods to witness his words. If he lies, it won't just bring shame, it risks divine punishment. Here's your fringe debate. Some scholars argue that the thing's circular layout echoes older Indo-European traditions, perhaps even connecting back to ancient ritual circles used by prehistoric tribal societies. Others believe the Vikings created these spaces independently, blending practicality with their unique worldview. As the oath-taker's voice echoes across the open space, you understand now this isn't simply court. It's ceremony. The Vikings saw law not as man-made, but as an extension of cosmic balance, an attempt to keep their world from unraveling into chaos. And while the circle holds them all together, at its center stands the man who binds their law to memory, the law speaker. And it's him you'll meet next. The crowd shifts as one figure steps forward, commanding attention, not with armor or weapon, but with the weight of words. You focus on the law speaker, or Log Zogumadr, standing at the heart of the circle, where his voice carries across the assembly like steady drum beats. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The law speaker was the most critical figure at the Viking thing. Elected by his peers, his primary duty was to memorize and publicly recite the entire body of law, because in Viking culture, the law lived in memory, not in parchment. You watch him now, his voice even rhythmic, almost melodic. There are no scrolls in his hands. Instead, generations of laws, precedents, and oaths reside in his mind, passed down like an epic saga. One mistake could shift the outcome of an entire case. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some law speakers were so respected for their memory and fairness that they became living legends, sometimes consulted long after retirement. You can imagine them as the Viking version of a legal Jedi, wise, revered, and occasionally grumpy about how the younger generation misquotes the law. Historians still argue whether law speakers functioned as neutral referees or wielded quiet political power behind the scenes. Some suggest that while their role was technically passive, merely reciting law, their interpretations could subtly influence decisions, especially in ambiguous cases. Others argue their power lay solely in memory, not judgment. The law speaker pauses now, allowing the disputing parties to respond. Every word he utters becomes part of the official record witnessed by the gathered free men. There are no secret chambers here. Everything happens in the open, under sky and scrutiny. Here's where you sense the deeper tension. The law is fixed, but its application breathes with each speaker's voice. Memory carries not just words, but emphasis. A pause here, a phrasing there, all can sway a verdict without ever breaking the letter of tradition. Occasionally, when no legal precedent exists, the law speaker may propose new laws, but only with the approval of the gathered assembly. This keeps him powerful, yet accountable, an echo of the Vikings' uneasy balance between authority and collective will. A younger man beside you whispers. He carries 3 winters of law in his mind. It's not a metaphor. Law speakers were often elected for terms of 3 years, during which they were expected to recite 1/3 of the entire law code from memory each summer. Here's your fringe debate. Some scholars speculate that the Vikings' reliance on oral law slowed the codification of written legal systems, delaying broader state formation. Others argue that this oral tradition preserved flexibility, allowing communities to adapt laws more fluidly than rigid written codes. You listen as the law speaker recites clauses on property boundaries, blood prices, and inheritance rules, each phrase etched into the minds of every man present, ensuring the law belongs not just to rulers, but to the entire community. And as he steps back, the next phase unfolds, where disputes shift from recitation to heated argument, personal insults, and sometimes duels. Because next you'll witness Viking drama at its most tense, when law pride and steel collide in open-air combat. The law speaker's voice fades, replaced by a rising murmur of tension. You feel the air thicken as two men step forward, broad-shouldered, flushed with anger, surrounded by kin, gripping axe handles a little too tightly. The dispute has moved from law to confrontation, from principle to pride. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Viking things weren't always calm debates. Though designed to settle conflicts peacefully, disputes sometimes escalated into duels known as holmgangs, where personal honor and legal rights were defended by blade. You watch as a space opens in the center of the circle. Lines are drawn in the dirt, weapons polished, and seconds chosen to supervise. This isn't mindless violence. It's ritualized, structured, and bizarrely legally sanctioned. The duel might settle property claims, accusations of dishonor, or unresolved blood feuds. Here's your quirky tidbit. The rules of holmgang were oddly precise. Combatants might be limited to a set number of shields required to strike within a specific area, or allowed to swap weapons mid-fight. It's like a terrifying game show with very sharp prizes. Historians still argue whether these duels were common practice or rare dramatic exceptions. Some suggest holmgangs offered a valuable safety valve for intense disputes. Others argue they disproportionately favored the wealthy and strong, turning law into a contest of muscle rather than merit. You see the two combatants circle each other, measured steps, eyes locked, breath visible in the cold air. The gathered crowd watches silently, every movement recorded not by scribes, but by dozens of sharp-eyed witnesses who will remember every detail for years. The first blow lands a clash of iron, a spray of dirt. Neither falls. Seconds call for pauses between rounds, allowing each man to adjust, catch his breath, and consider whether honor has been sufficiently satisfied. In some cases, a fighter might concede before blood is spilled if their opponent gains the upper hand. Here's where the law shows its strange pragmatism. The duel isn't always about death. Many holmgangs ended without fatal wounds, serving instead as public rituals of courage and personal justice. For the Vikings, honor could be defended without necessarily destroying the opponent. The law speaker watches closely. If either man violates the rules, stepping outside the lines, using forbidden strikes, or striking after surrender, their victory can be invalidated and punishment swiftly imposed. Even violence has boundaries here. You hear murmurs from the crowd. He fights well, but not well enough. The duel ends with one man's sword knocked from his hand. He lowers his head, breathless, beaten, but alive. The assembly nods. The dispute is settled. No long feud will follow. Here's your fringe debate. Some modern legal historians argue that Viking duels offered a primitive but surprisingly functional form of alternative dispute resolution, allowing conflicts to be publicly aired and quickly resolved. Others see them as brutal spectacles that undermined any claim to genuine legal fairness. As the circle closes again, the defeated man steps back into the crowd. No one jeers. The matter is finished. For now. But you sense that not all cases find such clean closure. Some simmer beneath the surface, returning to the thing year after year like unresolved ghosts. And as the day's drama cools, you'll witness how these open-air assemblies, even amid blood and bluster, were built on something remarkable: collective decision-making that placed consensus above the whims of kings. And that's exactly where you're heading next. The dual circle dissolves back into the broader gathering, and the murmurs of the crowd shift from blood and blades to something even more: dangerous politics. You sense a different kind of tension here, slower, quieter, but no less charged. Now comes the part that truly defines the thing: collective decision-making. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Unlike many medieval societies, Viking communities lacked absolute monarchs for much of their early history. Instead, the thing operated as a council of free men who debated and voted on laws, judgments, and collective decisions through consensus or majority rule. You watch as groups form small knots around the open space, chieftains conferring with followers, farmers whispering among themselves, merchants doing quick calculations in the margins. These aren't idle gossips. These are voters weighing the direction of their society. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Norse assemblies used the curious system of standing votes. Men physically moved to one side of the circle or another to show support for a proposal, kind of like an ancient Scandinavian version of musical chairs, but with much higher stakes. Historians still argue whether these consensus-driven gatherings were truly democratic or functioned more as oligarchies where powerful families steered decisions behind closed tents. Some suggest that while every free man had a voice, influence often followed wealth, kinship, and reputation. Others point out that even the most powerful chieftain had to convince others, no easy feat among fiercely independent farmers. The law speaker calls out the next proposal, a boundary dispute that could reshape farmland across 2 entire valleys. Voices rise, arguments sharpen, but still everyone remains within the circle's boundaries, as if the space itself reminds them that words, not blades, must carry the day. Here's where you notice something: rare patience. Vikings, famed for their ferocity, could also debate for days, allowing each voice to be heard before any consensus emerged. In a world built on fragile alliances, rushing a decision could invite future feuds. One chieftain rises now, his words carefully chosen. "My kin will accept the boundary if fair compensation follows." His rival nods slowly, calculating. The murmur of approval spreads as a compromise is born, a blend of law, trade, and personal pride. Here's your fringe debate. Some political theorists argue that these early things represent a unique proto-democratic experiment, a system that offered shared governance long before Europe's monarchies allowed anything close to it. Others argue that we should be cautious labeling it democracy, noting the exclusion of slaves, women, and outsiders from most formal votes. You glance around the circle again, sensing the real genius of the thing. It wasn't about perfect equality, it was about survival. In a harsh land where long winters and sharp swords loomed, no single man could afford unchecked power. Compromise wasn't weakness, it was necessary. As decisions are finalized and agreements sealed, the law speaker recites the new ruling, which will now join the oral code passed down for generations. The crowd exhales together, tension replaced by something like relief. But the thing wasn't only law and argument. It was also a festival, a marketplace, and a gathering of distant kin. And as night falls, you'll wander through the tents where feasting, trading, and quiet negotiations unfold under flickering torchlight. The sun dips low behind jagged hills, casting long shadows across the gathering. The air shifts from tense debate to something far more festive. You wander beyond the central circle now, into the sprawling tent city that blooms like a temporary village whenever the thing convenes. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The thing wasn't only a legal assembly, it was also a major social and economic event. While disputes and laws dominated the day evenings, brought feasts, trade matchmaking, and political alliances forged over mugs of mead. You move between rows of colorful tents, hearing the clang of blacksmiths hammering, the hum of traders haggling, and bursts of laughter from groups swapping tales. The smoky aroma of roasting meat mingles with the sharper scent of fermenting ale. This is part law court, part festival, part stock market, and part family reunion. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some ambitious entrepreneurs traveled from distant settlements specifically to attend The Thing, hauling carts of soapstone jewelry furs, amber beads, and even imported silks. Think of it as a Viking pop-up market, limited time, only no credit cards accepted. Historians still argue whether these commercial gatherings were central to The Thing's design, or simply opportunistic side effects. Some suggest that the market activity helped fund and sustain the legal gatherings, while others argue that trade simply followed wherever large groups of Vikings congregated. You pause at one booth where a bearded merchant shows off elaborately carved combs made from walrus ivory. A farmer nearby trades several sacks of barley for new iron tools. Deals are struck quickly but seriously, with oaths binding every transaction. Here's where you realize that The Thing wasn't just about justice. It was about connection. In an age of isolated homesteads and treacherous seas, these gatherings allowed distant families to exchange not only goods, but gossip alliances and marriage prospects. Children chase each other between stalls, while matchmakers whisper quietly about which daughter might suit which eligible bachelor. Kinship ties are renewed, and occasionally new feuds are quietly born as old rivalries simmer beneath forced smiles. A skald, one of the Viking poets, begins to chant. Near a central fire, weaving tales of past heroes and recent battles. His voice rises above the crowd, offering both entertainment and subtle political commentary. In this world, stories are currency, and every word carries weight. Here's your fringe debate. Some cultural historians argue that these gatherings offered a kind of cultural glue that helped hold Viking society together. Others argue that the intense mixing of commerce politics and personal grudges made The Thing as volatile as it was stabilizing. You stop beneath a large oak, where chiefs sit sharing horns of mead, quietly negotiating behind the legal stage. This is where land transfers, betrothal agreements, and secret pacts often unfold soft power, moving behind the formal process. The Thing is the public face. These fireside talks are where futures are quietly shaped. As night deepens, torches flicker against canvas walls. Laughter mixes with the low hum of serious conversation. For all the Viking world's harshness, The Thing offers brief, vital moments of unity. A chance to see and be seen, to barter and bond, to argue and reconcile. But tomorrow, the circle will gather again. And when it does, you'll witness something many outsiders never expect: how Viking women, often dismissed in other societies, held surprising influence within these open-air circles of law. Morning light spills once again across the open field as The Thing resumes. You notice something that doesn't quite fit the stereotype. Women are here not just watching from the sidelines, but speaking, advising, and occasionally stepping directly into the disputes themselves. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Viking women, while excluded from many formal political votes, held notable legal and economic rights compared to women in many other medieval societies. They could inherit property, initiate divorce, and represent themselves in certain legal matters. You spot a woman standing calmly within the circle, now addressing the assembly in a firm, clear voice. She speaks about a contested dowry after her husband's death, invoking inheritance laws that grant her rightful control of the land at stake. The men gathered listen without interruption. She isn't an anomaly, she's part of how the system works. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some cases, Viking women served as Verguild negotiators, calculating compensation for crimes committed against their families, including killings or injuries. Think of them as early settlement lawyers, but armed with both sharp math skills and sharper reputations. Historians still argue whether this level of female legal agency was widespread or primarily limited to certain regions like Iceland, where the sagas recorded numerous instances of women actively using the law to defend their interests. Some suggest Norse culture was unusually flexible about gender roles compared to contemporaneous Europe. Others warn against projecting modern ideas too eagerly onto ancient customs. You overhear two men whisper as the woman presents her case. She quotes the law like a law speaker. The respect is real. Memory and knowledge, after all, carry weight here regardless of who speaks. Here's where you glimpse the Viking worldview's blend of practicality and necessity. In isolated farming societies, women often managed estates while men sailed off on long voyages. Legal systems that ignored their competence would have collapsed under their own impracticality. You watch another woman quietly negotiating a property boundary on behalf of her father, who grows too old to argue. She gestures to witnesses, presents the family's case, and brokers a compromise before tempers flare. No axe is needed, only clarity. Here's your fringe debate. Some feminist scholars argue that Viking law circles represent a rare early model of partial gender equity, limited but remarkable for its time. Others caution that while elite women could wield significant influence, enslaved and lower-class women remained largely voiceless within the system. Even marriage negotiations unfold here with surprising balance. Dowries, prenuptial agreements, and household responsibilities are openly discussed, ensuring both families feel secure before binding oaths are sworn. These aren't secret negotiations behind castle walls. They happen under open sky, in full view of the community. You sense the quiet power flowing beneath the spectacle. Women may not dominate the debates, but when they step forward, everyone listens. Knowledge of law matters more than gender. In a society obsessed with honor, credibility transcends roles. As the woman steps back, having secured her claim, the circle shifts again. The assembly now prepares for one of its most sacred rituals, the swearing of oaths before the gods and stones that witness every word. And that's where you'll go next to see how divine presence blended with law beneath the open Norse sky. The wind carries a hush now, as the assembly shifts into something heavier, older, almost reverent. Disputes may come and go, but oaths live forever. You watch as the crowd parts, revealing the sacred stones, standing like silent sentinels near the edge of the circle. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Oaths sworn at the Thing weren't casual promises. In Viking society, oaths invoked the gods themselves, as witnesses binding men and sometimes women to their word, with the threat of both legal punishment and divine wrath. You see men step forward, placing their hands on smooth-worn stones, or raising arm rings blessed in the names of Odin, Thor, and Freyr. Their voices are steady because failure here carries consequences far beyond this meeting. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some regions, special oath rings were stored inside temples or sacred groves and transported to the Thing for important ceremonies. The rings weren't merely symbolic. They were believed to embody the god's presence directly, almost like divine recording devices. Historians still argue whether these oath rituals originated purely from Norse pagan practice, or blended older Germanic Celtic and possibly even Indo-European ceremonial traditions. Some suggest these rites date back to long-lost tribal customs, while others believe Viking religion uniquely amplified the spiritual weight of legal oaths. The first oath-taker declares his loyalty in a land dispute, invoking the gods to witness his honesty. The crowd listens not for entertainment, but for precision. A false oath isn't just shameful, it threatens to unravel the entire system. Here's where you sense the heartbeat of Viking law. Trust isn't enforced by endless paperwork, but by community memory and divine oversight. In a world where written contracts are rare, your word once given binds you as tightly as iron chains. You observe another man hesitate slightly, just enough to make his opponent's family mutter. That pause will haunt him if future disputes arise. In the Norse mind, hesitation hints at deceit, and deceit offends not only men, but gods. A priest nearby sprinkles ale onto the sacred stone, offering a brief invocation to ensure the gods remain attentive. Let the word stand true under sky and stone. He chants softly, eyes closed, as if feeling their gaze settle upon the circle. Here's your fringe debate. Some religious scholars argue that Viking legal oaths served as a kind of spiritual contract management system, creating not only social order, but a binding bridge between mortal law and cosmic balance. Others debate how deeply average Vikings feared divine punishment versus simple social consequences. You glance around and realize how the circle itself feels different during these oaths. The same men who shouted during disputes now stand still respectful, almost small beneath the towering sky. In this moment, the thing belongs to forces older than any chieftain. As the final oath is sworn, the law speaker's voice rises again, reciting aloud the new judgment permanently recorded not on parchment, but in the living memory of every soul present and under the eternal eyes of gods who never forget. But not all outcomes are resolved with oaths alone. Some require harsh consequences, banishment, exile, or even outlawry. And that is where you'll walk next, into the darkest corners of Viking justice. The circle grows colder now, though the sun still hangs in the sky. You feel a subtle shift, the weight of consequence settling over the assembly. Not every dispute ends in compromise or reconciliation. Some end here in the most severe judgments. Viking law can deliver outlawry, exile, or blood price. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Viking law employed a mix of punishments, often favoring exile and financial restitution over imprisonment or execution. The ultimate sentence was outlawry, skoganger, banishment from society, stripping a person of all legal protection. You watch as a man stands alone before the gathered assembly accused of murder. His kin stand behind him, tense but silent. The law speaker recites the ruling with somber authority. The man has failed to offer sufficient restitution, no settlement, no compensation. The blood price remains unpaid. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some outlawed men painted their shields black to signify their status. Any person could kill them without fear of legal repercussion. And yet, many survived in remote forests or fled across seas to distant lands. Outlawry wasn't always a death sentence, but it was often a one-way door. Historians still argue whether Viking outlawry served primarily as a legal deterrent or as a social safety valve, removing dangerous individuals without resorting to permanent bloodshed. Some suggest exile allowed communities to avoid endless cycles of vengeance. Others note that many outlawed men returned as raiders or mercenaries. You feel the tension rise as the sentence is announced. Outlawed for 3 winters. No kin may shelter him. No man may defend him. The words are final. The man's shoulders sag. His fate now rests with harsh landscapes and uncertain mercy. Here's where you see the law's brutal elegance. In a world where prison systems didn't exist, banishment served as both punishment and protection for the community. The guilty were removed, and the cycle of revenge was at least in theory broken. But exile wasn't the only tool. You overhear a negotiation nearby where 2 families calculate a vörgild, the blood price, for an accidental killing. The amount varies based on the victim's status: a farmer, a chieftain, a thrall. Every life has a price carefully weighed in silver, cattle, or land. One elder explains quietly to a younger relative, better silver than blood. Silver feeds widows, blood feeds wolves. His wisdom rings heavy in the air. Here's your fringe debate. Some legal historians argue that Viking vörgild systems represent early forms of restorative justice, valuing social repair over retribution. Others argue they simply reflect transactional thinking in honor cultures, where wealth measured both status and peace. You watch as the families exchange silver weighed in balance scales. No one smile. This is not celebration, it's survival. Averted feud means spared lives, and in these lands, that is victory enough. Meanwhile, in the distance, a smaller crowd gathers around another outcast, this one stripped of property, but not exiled. Lesser crimes still carried shame, public floggings, temporary servitude, or the loss of legal standing for a set number of years. Here's where you grasp the stark truth. Viking law didn't pretend to rehabilitate. It sought balance between the living and the dead, between family and community, between mercy and deterrence. As the judgments conclude, the circle shifts once more. Now it prepares to travel to the greatest thing of them all, where these open-air circles reach their grandest form beneath Iceland's sweeping sky. That's where you'll stand next, Thingvellir. You feel the air shift once again, but this time, it's not simply the mood, it's the very landscape. The small regional things you've witnessed fade behind you as you arrive at the most famous of them all, Thingvellir, Iceland's Grand Assembly. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Founded around 930 CE. Thingvellir served as the central meeting place for Iceland's National Assembly, the Althing, one of the oldest continuous parliamentary bodies in the world. Here, all free men gathered annually to settle disputes, pass laws, and decide the future of their young island society. You stand now in a wide valley where dramatic cliffs rise behind you, the Almannagjá Rift splitting the earth. This is not just geography, it's symbolism carved into stone. The place feels massive, yet intimate, as if the land itself were listening. Here's your quirky tidbit. The location wasn't chosen at random. Thingvellir offered a natural amphitheater where voices could carry without modern microphones. The cliffs behind the Law Rock, or Lugberg, served as perfect acoustic reflectors for the law speaker's booming voice. Early Viking sound engineering, if you will. Historians still argue whether Thingvellir's selection was purely practical or deeply spiritual. Some suggest the dramatic landscape embodied the Viking sense of divine order, a place where man's fragile law sat beneath the gods' mighty mountains and endless sky. Others argue it was simply chosen because it was conveniently located near major settlement clusters. You step toward the Lugberg itself, a simple rocky outcrop, where the law speaker stands to address thousands of gathered Icelanders. No throne, no dais, just bare stone beneath his boots and sharp sky above his head. Around you stretch hundreds of tents and booths, forming a temporary town alive with noise, debate, feasting, and commerce. Farmers, traders, poets, and warriors mingle here in a vibrant human swirl that only appears once each year. Here's where Thingvellir elevates the very idea of the thing. This isn't just one small community settling its grievances. This is an entire nation of fiercely independent families agreeing year after year to gather and govern themselves without a king. You watch as laws are debated, new proposals voiced, and judgments delivered, all under the watchful eyes of chieftains, farmers, and foreign visitors alike. There is a tense but undeniable pride here, free men governing free men beneath no crown but the sky. Here's your fringe debate. Some political theorists view Thingvellir as one of the purest examples of early decentralized governance influencing later democratic traditions. Others argue that despite the appearance of equality, powerful families still quietly controlled much behind the scenes. You wander the edge of the assembly, overhearing marriages, arranged trade routes negotiated, and legal reforms proposed. Every piece of Viking society seems to pass through Thingvellir, law, commerce, culture, and myth, blending into one colossal gathering. And as you gaze up at the cliffs, catching the last golden light of the day, you realize that while most medieval kingdoms ruled from fortified castles, the Vikings ruled from an open field under sky and stone, an act of governance that remains astonishing even now. But Thingvellir was not built from chaos alone. Beneath these open-air assemblies lay careful structure marked by ancient ships, stone rings, and deliberate design. And that's where you'll walk next, into the physical bones of Viking legal architecture. The sun rises over Thingvellir, casting long shadows across the scattered tents and grassy fields. You walk the assembly grounds now with new eyes, not as a spectator, but as someone beginning to see the careful bones beneath the Viking chaos. This isn't random. This space was designed deliberately symbolically and functionally. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Many Viking things were physically marked by stone circles, ship-shaped outlines, or designated standing areas. The architecture of these open-air courts reflected not just the need for order, but the Vikings' deep connection to symbolism and structure. You pause before one of the stone markers weathered and lichen-covered. It sits at the edge of an oval clearing, a ship-shaped court where smaller regional things often met. The ship shape wasn't decorative, it carried meaning. For seafaring Norsemen, the ship was both life and lore, carrying them through trade war and now justice. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some archaeological sites suggest that stones were placed to mimic longships during thing meetings, creating symbolic law ships where participants stood inside the hull-shaped perimeter, as though aboard a vessel of order navigating dangerous social waters. Historians still argue whether these ship outlines were widespread practice or only found in certain regions. Some believe these symbolic layouts served to invoke protection from the gods. Others suggest they helped organize crowds into manageable speaking positions like a giant open-air courtroom. You watch as people stand in rough rings, speakers moving forward one at a time, while elders sit on simple benches or stones placed strategically around the circle. There's no central judge's seat. Authority comes from process, not elevation. Here's where you glimpse another layer of Viking pragmatism. By using natural markers like stones, rivers, or trees, the assembly could return year after year to the same layout without permanent construction, perfect for societies that needed flexibility across seasons and regions. A chieftain gestures toward a standing stone as he addresses his followers. "By this stone, our oaths hold," he declares. These markers weren't just boundaries. They were witnesses anchoring words into memory and space. Nearby, a row of large flat rocks serves as makeshift seating for the most respected elders and law speakers. They sit slightly elevated, but not separated, blending authority with accessibility, a visual reminder that power here flows through consensus, not decree. Here's your fringe debate. Some archaeologists argue that Viking legal architecture reflects a fusion of practical gathering spaces, with spiritual worldviews blurring the line between government religion and community ritual. Others suggest the designs were entirely pragmatic adaptations to harsh northern environments. You step further into the field, tracing the invisible lines where hundreds of free men once stood shoulder to shoulder, their placement signaling not rank, but kinship groups and alliances. The thing was not faceless bureaucracy. Everyone knew who stood beside them. Even the location of markets, tent clusters, and feast grounds followed familiar patterns each year, creating temporary order in what could easily become chaotic crowds. After centuries of repetition, the land itself seems to remember where each family's booth should rise. As you leave the stony outlines behind, you realize how these simple arrangements allowed Viking law to function in wide open spaces, turning fields into courts, rocks into records, and gatherings into government. But these circles were more than gatherings of men. They stood at the strange crossroads of kingship, freedom, and collective rule. And next you'll witness the great debate whether the thing was truly democratic or simply its own clever version of controlled power. The wind gusts gently across Thingvellir, carrying whispers of debate far older than today's gathering. You feel it swirling not only through the crowd, but through time itself. The ongoing question that still echoes: was this democracy or something else entirely? Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Viking thing often gets described as a proto-democracy with free men voting on laws and disputes. Yet beneath the surface, power flowed unevenly, shaped by wealth, kinship, and reputation. You watch as a chieftain stands near the Lögberg, flanked by loyal supporters. His voice carries weight not simply because of his words, but because of who stands behind him. Influence at the thing is earned and sometimes bought. Here's your quirky tidbit. Wealthy farmers sometimes secured political support by throwing lavish feasts during the thing. A well-fed neighbor is a loyal neighbor after all. Nothing says vote for me quite like roasted lamb and endless mead. The Vikings may not have invented campaign dinners, but they definitely understood their value. Historians still argue whether the thing truly offered equal political power to all free men, or whether it operated as an oligarchy cloaked in communal tradition. Some point to wide participation as evidence of democratic values. Others highlight how elite families subtly controlled outcomes through alliances and patronage. You observe a group of lesser landowners gathered nearby, quietly debating whether to support a new trade policy proposed by a powerful family. They'll vote yes, but they're weighing not just the merits of the law, but the consequences of angering their influential neighbors. Here's where Viking law reveals its balancing act. The system allowed broad participation, but within a social hierarchy that made total equality impossible. Influence flowed like the rivers feeding this valley, winding branching shaped by unseen terrain beneath. You hear one elder whisper to another. He speaks for his kin, but the law belongs to us all. It's not cynicism, it's an understanding that while power tilts, the thing still requires public participation to function. Here's your fringe debate. Some political theorists argue that Viking assemblies offer an early example of consensus-driven governance, a hybrid of oligarchy and grassroots input that may have influenced later Scandinavian political culture. Others warn against romanticizing the system, noting its exclusions and quiet coercions. Even within this imperfect system, the Vikings achieved something unusual for their time: regular public lawmaking that resisted both tyranny and chaos. Unlike absolute monarchies elsewhere, no single man ruled here. Decisions required negotiation, compromise, and community buy-in. You see the law speaker step forward once again, summarizing the day's rulings. The decisions may favor the powerful, but they remain subject to open-airing collective memory and accountability before God's stones and neighbors. Here's where the thing's genius truly shines. It transforms personal disputes into public theater, preventing private feuds from consuming entire communities. Even when imperfect, the process protects the fragile web holding Norse society together. As the assembly draws toward its final rulings, you prepare to witness how the echoes of these Viking law circles didn't vanish with time, but instead planted seeds that still bloom in modern parliaments and courtrooms today. The circle begins to break apart now as rulings are finalized, deals are sealed, and voices drift into quiet conversations. But as you walk through the thinning crowd, you start to hear echoes of something strangely familiar. Echoes that carry forward all the way to modern government. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Many historians recognize that Viking assemblies like the Thing influenced later legal and parliamentary developments in Scandinavia and beyond. Iceland's Althing still exists today, often cited as the world's oldest continuous parliament. You pass a small group of younger men, gathered under a tent, arguing enthusiastically, not about livestock or boundaries, but about law itself. They're debating proposed changes, new disputes, and interpretations of ancient rulings. This isn't static tradition. It's evolving alive, always under negotiation. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some parts of Norway, local things survived, long after the Viking Age, eventually blending into medieval assemblies that informed regional governance. Even the modern Norwegian parliament, the Storting, carries the memory of the old things in its very name, which means the great thing. Historians still argue whether these influences were direct lines of continuity or loose cultural echoes. Some believe the Vikings consciously handed down legal traditions that evolved into early parliamentary forms. Others argue that much of what survives was reinvented during later nation-building efforts. You watch two elders recall the law speaker's words from previous years, debating subtle changes in phrasing that could shift today's outcomes. Their sharp memories serve as living legal records, a system that oddly resembles early forms of constitutional debate, even without written constitutions. Here's where you realize that the Thing's most enduring gift wasn't just its rulings, but its method: public debate, collective memory, legal consensus, and checks on absolute authority, all elements that resonate in many modern democratic institutions. A nearby merchant smiles as he hands over a parchment contract. Yes, parchment now evidence that even in the late Viking period, some written law codes began to supplement oral tradition. The first seeds of written governance are sprouting beneath your feet. Here's your fringe debate. Some political scholars suggest that had Viking governance continued uninterrupted, Scandinavia might have developed formal democratic institutions centuries earlier than much of Europe. Others argue that external pressures, Christianity, monarchy, and feudalism inevitably bent Viking political traditions towards centralized rule. You step to the edge of Thingvellir, looking back at the open field now beginning to empty. The booths collapse, the traders pack their goods, the families break camp. Yet the land itself still holds every word, every oath, every verdict whispered into its grass and stone. Though kings, empires, and nations would rise and fall, the essence of the thing, the open circle, the public voice, the binding word refused to die completely. You can still feel it today in courtrooms, parliaments, and even small-town council meetings, where voices gather to settle disputes and steer communities. And as the last torches are extinguished, you'll walk one final time through these ancient fields into the quiet legacy that still whispers through every society that seeks to balance freedom law and the weight of human voices. The field lies almost empty now. The tents have been taken down, the booths dismantled, and the crowds dispersed across the fjords and valleys they came from. But you remain for a moment, standing in the silence that follows the thing. And even in the stillness, you hear echoes. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Long after the Viking Age ended, the spirit of the thing lived on, both formally and culturally. Iceland's Althing continued. Scandinavian countries carried traces of collective governance, and modern democratic ideals quietly borrowed from these early assemblies. You breathe in the cold, clean air and feel the weight of the empty circle. Though thousands stood here days ago, what remains isn't emptiness, it's continuity. The people leave, but the law stays. Here's your quirky tidbit. In modern Iceland, Thingvellir is now a national park and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Couples get married on the ancient Law Rock. Tourists walk the Rift Valley where lawmakers once gathered. The space where exile oaths and duels once ruled now hosts wedding vows and selfie sticks. Historians still argue whether the thing was a singular invention of Norse society or part of a broader tapestry of early assembly cultures seen across Germanic and Celtic worlds. Some even suggest the Vikings refined older tribal practices into their uniquely robust form of open-air governance. You look down at the simple ring of stones, still marking the old assembly grounds. It's not grand architecture. No marble columns, no golden thrones. Just earthstone, sky, and memory. And yet, this sparse design outlived palaces and fortresses many times over. Here's where the thing's final genius reveals itself. It was built not on structures, but on trust, on oaths, on memory, on community. It was fragile, yet incredibly durable, because it required every person who stood inside that circle to carry part of its weight. The Vikings didn't create perfection. They created resilience. They built a system that accepted argument, permitted mistakes, demanded accountability, and always left room for words before blades. In their harsh world, that was revolutionary. You turn one last time toward the empty circle, and in your mind, you hear the law speaker's voice rise again, his words carried by wind across stone and water. Thus is the law spoken. Thus shall it be remembered. And with that, you let the quiet settle in, knowing that far beyond these northern fields, the echoes of Viking law circles continue. Whenever communities gather beneath open skies, listen to one another, and strive, however imperfectly, to turn voices into justice. The soft hush of twilight wraps gently around you, now like a wool cloak warmed by centuries of voices. The winds that once carried the fierce debates and solemn oaths of the things have quieted, leaving only a peaceful breeze drifting across the open fields of Thingvellir. The circle, once alive with tension and ceremony, now rests under the pale northern sky, its stones cool beneath gathering mist. The world feels larger here and smaller all at once, as though the weight of law and history still floats in the air, but speaks now only in whispers. You breathe slowly, letting the cool air settle into your chest, feeling your heartbeat slow to match the gentle rhythm of the land itself, steady, ancient, unhurried. The memories of those long-gone lawmakers seem to drift like smoke rising into the darkening sky where the gods once watched. In this stillness, you carry with you the quiet wisdom of the Vikings, that even in a world of iron and storms, words could hold power. That community could gather under open skies and speak peace into existence. That every voice mattered and every silence carried meaning. The night deepens, the air cools, the last echoes fade, and all that remains is calm. You feel the softness settle into your bones, and with it sleep arrives gentle, quiet, and complete. Sweet dreams.